Welcome to episode 8, Two Pastors and a Plant. Another interesting conversation today. The question, very simply, and we'll go down from here. We'll have a lot more questions.
Sure.
Broadly, what is tongues?
Well, biblical tongues, I guess, not
Yes, biblical tongues.
not the appendage in your mouth.
Yes.
We really only see it in a couple of places in the New Testament. We read about the gift of speaking in tongues in Acts 2, and we also read about it in 1 Corinthians. I think those are the only two places. And in Acts 2, it's very clear, Acts chapter 2, that what's going on there is xenoglossia, the ability to speak in a foreign language that you haven't studied. So the only language I can speak is English. I've taken some Greek, I've taken some Hebrew, I've taken some French, I've taken some Spanish over the years, but I can't speak any of them. So if all of a sudden I could start speaking in Russian, that would be xenoglossia. I could speak in a known foreign language. And there's just no doubt in my mind that's what's happening in Acts 2, because you have at Pentecost all these Jews from places around the Roman Empire, and they say, we hear these Galileans speaking in our dialect. So I think that's, and nothing in the rest of the book of Acts.
There's another experience in 8 or 9.
Well, there's another one in 8, there's another one in 10, there's another one in 19. Although they may not all talk about speaking in tongues. We read about the Spirit falling on them in 8, 10, and 19. I'm not sure in every instance they're speaking in tongues.
8 for sure.
But 8's Samaria. But at any rate, that's what's going on in Acts. And there's, even though it's not, in Acts chapter 8, for example, even though it's not clear that they are speaking known foreign languages in that instance, because of the context of the book of Acts, I think you'd need to have some evidence that that's not what's going on.
Because it hasn't said otherwise.
Because it'd be using the word in a different way, and there's no reason to suggest from the book itself that.
But in Corinthians,
it's a different story, because that's where Paul talks about the gift, the spiritual gifts, beginning in chapter 12, and literally though I think in Greek it's just the spirituals. It's not spiritual gifts. I think that's kind of that's a translation. That's a paraphrase. But he talks about do all speak in tongues in verse 30, and that's in the context of spiritual gifts. And then he says in chapter 14, he talks about the difference between speaking in tongues and prophesying. And he says that when he speaks in tongues, his mind is unfruitful, but his spirit prays. As opposed to prophecy, where it seems like his mind is fruitful along with his spirit. And so I think there's an argument to be made that there's another gift of tongues, besides what we see in the book of Acts, that possibly there is something that a lot of our more charismatic brethren would call a private prayer language. I've heard other people call it angel speech. Or glossia, not xenoglossia, but just glossia, speaking in tongues, where it's not a known foreign language.
something else entirely.
Linguists have studied Pentecostals praying in tongues time and time again, and they can't discern any kind of pattern, any kind of linguistic pattern to what they're doing. You know, any language a linguist, if it's written down, can parse it and see where the nouns and the verbs and the different parts of speech are. They've done this with the glossia, the angel speech, and there's just nothing there. And what my Pentecostal friends tell me is, well, that's exactly right. I don't even know what I'm saying, but it's a spiritual, powerful experience that happens. And I'm an agnostic on that. It could be something from God. It could not be. If it is something from God, it basically disappeared from the history of the church for 18 centuries, because we don't read anything about this until the Azusa Street revival in Los Angeles in 1906, I think. And that's where the modern Pentecostal movement was born. But I'm an agnostic. It could be could be a second spiritual gift of tongue speaking, or maybe it's not.
So let's just clarify for people who have this question and have the categories of cessationism in their mind. Would you consider yourself cessationist?
No, because I don't think nowhere in the Bible does it say cessationism means we believe that all the miraculous gifts, healing, prophecy, tongue speaking, they have definitely ceased. And I I just I don't think we can go there from the Scripture. The evidence isn't there, and there are enough wild and crazy things that have happened throughout church history for me to think, well, if the Scripture doesn't mandate that we go there, then why would we go there? And Paul himself says in 1 Corinthians 14:39, be eager to prophesy and do not forbid speaking in tongues. And it sure seems like the cessationists are forbidding speaking in tongues are going against Paul.
That's my next question. Paul says later, I think more than anybody that I have this ability to speak in tongues.
He says it in 14:18.
So what would be a healthy way to approach this? If I'm honest with myself, it would be really cool to, in a different way, connect with God in a private prayer language or different language or whatever, if God's allowed me to speak in a different tongue. And so, what would be a healthy way for me to pursue, if I should pursue something like this at all?
Well, Paul says eagerly, he says, eagerly desire spiritual gifts in 14:1. He says, be eager to prophesy and do not forbid speaking in tongues. He doesn't say eagerly desire to speak in tongues. I think that's pretty clear. But I don't think it's wrong. I'll just go by what John Piper said years ago. He said that he prayed to speak in tongues and he hasn't been given that gift. And he did not think that saying banana backwards, 100 times, which is, in all honesty, that's what some of our Pentecostal friends suggest, that you kind of prime the pump of tongue speaking by doing these kind of exercises. He said he just thought that didn't feel right to him, didn't feel like that would be how the Lord would operate, and I would agree. So I've prayed to speak in tongues too, and it's never happened. But I would say that'd be a healthy way to do it. Here it is in the Bible. It's a gift. You're a good father. I'm asking you for a gift. If he says yes, great. If he says no, no big deal.
And so, obviously, I think what you're saying is there's a distinction. I mean, there's a school, very popular school out in California, that literally teaches you how to do this, and you can practice it, right? And there's another approach, the John Piper approach.
They teach you how to speak in tongues at Bethel?
You can practice it.
Okay, I didn't know that.
And, to me, that's a huge difference. And obviously, I think what you're saying is this idea that we can pray and we can ask God to give it to us and yield to Him whenever He gives it to us. Same thing with healing. Same thing with prophesying.
Either you can heal somebody with your prayers or you can't. I don't know how you practice that. And I think it's much the same with speaking in tongues.
Great. Is there anything else that we need to address on this topic that you would like to say?
No, I just... my only other concern would be if anybody is feeling pressured to speak in tongues, certainly any pastors, I don't know that any pastors watch this, but any pastors that feel pressured by some members in your church who act like they're more spiritual than you are, any kind of hint of you're not quite as spiritual as I am because you don't speak in tongues, I wouldn't laugh in their face because that wouldn't be very kind. But I mean, that is not the mark of spirituality. Paul says, 1 Corinthians 13, it's all about love. And he actually says tongues and prophecy, even prophecy, and martyrdom, they're nothing without love. So what we should rightly desire the spiritual gifts, and the ultimate spiritual gift is faith, hope, and then love. That's the greatest of these. And that's where our focus needs to be as Christians. And I would just be wary of anybody that made too big of a deal of tongues. I'm wary of cessationists who can't shut up about how tongues have ceased. I stay away from them. But I'm also, nervous about the people who can't talk about it enough and how awesome it is and how spiritual and close to God it makes them feel. That makes me nervous too. Faith, hope, and love. That seems to be what the Bible wants us to follow.
Great answer. Last thing I just thought of, you made me think. So, Grace, our services, we've never, to my knowledge, had anyone speaking in tongues up front or anything like that. What would happen? I guess, why don't we? First of all, he's talking about in order. Have this in order. So, what would happen if somebody did manifest that? What if you started speaking in tongues?
Boy, I hope we have that one on video if it happens. Because I'd want to see it.
Yeah.
I think when the church in Corinth was so small that when Paul wrote this, it may have felt more like what we would call a small group meeting, because it's not just open to it's not just open to tongue speaking, but he says 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and it should be done decently and in order. And it just feels like the church there is so small in Corinth, and it probably was. I mean, this is, the church isn't a year old probably when Paul writes this. That it's not hundreds of people gathered in a room. So when we think of a church gathering, we because there are so many people, so many more people involved than what was going on in 1 Corinthians, we're just not applying the same metrics.
We just can't say, hey, if you want to speak.
Yeah, so we don't. That's why we don't invite 2 or 3 people to speak on a Sunday, because I'm set aside, he's set aside to study all week and bring a message to study the Bible. But in newer churches and smaller churches, certainly in missionary contexts, when you don't have the time to do that, well, you gather all the saints in a room and you open up the Bible and you talk about it. And I think that's what's going on here in 1 Corinthians. But even that's got to be orderly, Paul says. But back to your original question, what if somebody interrupted the service and started speaking in tongues? By the way, we have had somebody interrupt the service and argue with me before, and thankfully he didn't argue long, and it was over with. But that's happened a couple other times at previous churches too, where somebody just started talking in the middle of the service, and I had to kind of work through that. But if somebody started speaking in tongues, it's never happened in 16 years, but if somebody started speaking in tongues, I would say, okay, someone is speaking in tongues. Is there an interpreter? Because clearly Paul says someone must interpret. That's 1 Corinthians 14:27. And if nobody spoke up, then I would say, I'm sorry, you're out of order. Please sit down. And then even if there was an interpreter in the room, I would talk to them both after the service and say, okay, Paul says the spirit of the prophets are subject to the control of the prophets. This is not something that just came over you and you were compelled to speak. I would be suspicious that they had planned this out, and especially depending on what the interpreter was saying, especially if it was contrary to something we do at Grace, I would be suspicious, just being honest. But I would let them speak one time, and then depending on what they said, I'd gather the elders up. Because it'd be really weird if God revealed something to our church in that context outside of the leadership of the church. It's just not how the church is organized. And I'd have a conversation with them and say, the spirit of the prophets are subject to the control of the prophets. Can we think of another way to do this? Mm-hmm. Especially if the interpretation was something like, you all need to love one another. And I would say, well, thank you. I mean, we kind of knew that already, but point taken. Mm-hmm. I've never seen it done in a way that, I don't know. I would be kind of suspicious about somebody in our church interrupting in that way, but I would give them one chance for sure, and then I definitely want to have a conversation afterwards.
Great. Thanks for talking about that. We're going to talk about more issues surrounding spiritual gifts in the future. We're going to have a series, actually, I think starting next week, on heaven. So if you have any questions on heaven, we'd love to hear them, what it looks like. We're going to talk about a lot of stuff. So we're excited about that, and we'll see you next week.